Welcome to the Dare to Multiply podcast. On this podcast, we help passionate Jesus followers become courageous, obedient disciples who impact their communities for the kingdom of God. I'm your host, Cynthia Anderson, a disciple multiplication coach and trainer.
And I'm Jen Chang, a disciple maker and coach based here in Thailand. We have some amazing topics and guests coming up, great people who are taking risks to launch new discipleship movements in their areas. We're excited to learn from them and introduce you to their ministries.
So if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any great tools or content coming your way. And I also want to mention we just introduced a new community and exclusive access channels for those who want to explore further or dive deeper into our disciple-making content. Check that out at multipliersmindset.com/DTM membership. DMM, CPM, T for T, microchurch, 4 fields. There are so many different terms that we use in this church multiplication, disciple multiplication world, and they have different meanings for different people. And so it's important to know what they mean, how they originated, what they've come to mean, and all these things as we explore multiplying disciples of Jesus in cooperation and collaboration with others who are also doing the same thing and have that same heart. And so today we have a real treat of having Cory Hartman from New Generations on the podcast with us, and he's going to help make some of the things clearer and help us also look at kind of the future. Why does this matter? Where are we going in the area of terms that relate to this in different contexts? And I think you're going to really enjoy this. So I'll be right back with that in just a moment. Are you busy but not seeing the fruit you long for? Dissatisfied with your present level of impact on those around you? Or frustrated with traditional methods of discipleship that don't seem to be effective? If so, the Getting Started in Disciple Making Movements course may be just what you need. Inside the Getting Started program, you'll get access to a step-by-step proven approach to making and multiplying disciples. Not only will you receive 25 short and practical video teachings spread out over 6 modules, but you'll have a chance to connect with others for group coaching via our monthly Zoom calls. And even more importantly, you'll become part of a global community of like-minded people from all over the world who are passionately committed to following Jesus and impacting others around them. If you want to get unstuck and begin moving forward as a disciple who makes disciples, I encourage you to go to courses.dmmsfrontiermissions.com and sign up for this powerful program today. And now to today's episode. Okay, well, I am here with Cory Hartman. Cory, so great to have you on the Dare to Multiply podcast. Welcome.
It is so great to be here, Cynthia. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. And we were just saying before the call, I'm surprised we haven't met in person before somewhere in the world. We've both been involved in movement work for a long time, but this is great. I get to have this conversation. So happy for that.
Yeah, likewise. Big time.
Yeah, awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got started in this multiplication journey, especially pursuing disciples who make disciples.
Absolutely. Well, for my story, honestly, so I've been in the trying to see people come to Jesus world for a long time. I've actually not been in the movements world for a long time. So my story is that so I'm an American. I live in the United States, and I was a pastor of small churches for 13 years. And at the end of that time, when I stepped away from a congregational pastor role, this was 8 years ago now, I started doing something that I never imagined that I would do, which was to become a collaborative writer with Christian leaders and organizations. And so I was working as a freelancer first, and then later got hired on full-time to one organization. And I was working for various clients who were all in what I guess could be called the church leadership space, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And these were all people who had great ideas, were highly intelligent, very good communicators, but either they didn't have the facility or proficiency, or they didn't have the time to put those things into writing. And so I helped them to do that in the form of curriculum and in the form of books. I helped a lot of people write books. And through that time, once I had left the serving as a pastor in a local church, which was often very difficult, and at the end was very, very difficult. It gave me some space to look at church as we know it in a different way, not from somebody who's responsible for the well-being of an institution, but sort of from an insider outsider sort of position. And during that, plus along with talking with and communing deeply with leaders that I was working for, some of whom were brilliant church consultants, and also just my time in the scriptures, it really began to have me reevaluate and reassess and re-understand really what we're supposed to be about anyway. And so there were a number of different themes and influences in that, but that was progressing for several years. And then one of those organizations I was working for, one that I started to work for full time, it dissolved. And at that time, somebody I met through that recruited me to the organization that I'm working for now, which is New Generations. And I've been with New Generations for 3 years now. And that is a network of networks, so to speak, that is a convener of partners from around the world working in indigenous situations, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but not exclusively in those places, that are doing this disciple-making movement stuff. And so through that journey after being a pastor, I was already really being set up theologically, philosophically, to then embrace disciple making movement stuff when I was exposed to it. And I jumped in whole hog. And so the first thing I did when I jumped in then was to try to get caught up on this conversation that had been going on for 25 some years that I didn't even know existed, as a not movements person and not even as a professional missions person. And so I did a real deep dive in the literature and talking to a whole lot of people to understand what in the world was going on, so that then I could speak intelligently about it. So yeah, that's basically how I got here.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. And I didn't know your history for sure. I've interacted with you on some groups that we're mutually working in and email threads and talking about different things. So, yeah, I know you bring a lot to this call as someone with kind of fresh eyes to these terms. And, for me, I've been entrenched in it, doing it since I was in my early 20s. But yeah, it's interesting to see what you are observing and how you've been learning about these things. And we're looking forward to that and talking more about that. The title of this podcast is How Movement Terminology Has Evolved, and maybe even a little bit getting into the why. And we may do that more on the diving deeper interview, but how it's evolved and it's constantly changed, and terminologies are always changing and language is always changing actually in our culture and society. But tell us a little bit from your understanding, just kind of give us a historical overview of the different terms. There's so many of them, but church planting movement or CPM, disciple making movement, DMM, T for T, training for trainers. There's so many different terms. Micro church is one that's being used a lot in the US. How have these terms in your understanding come about? And just give us a brief kind of historical overview if you could, Cory.
Yeah, well, I will do my best, Cynthia. It's complicated terrain, but I'll try to be our guide here. So I'll start with that term, church planting movements, abbreviated CPM. Before it was abbreviated CPM, and it was just the term church planting movements, the earliest use of that term in print that I know of was in the work of a group that was convened in 1982 by the Lausanne Committee on World Evangelization, before it renamed itself Lausanne Movement. And the aim of that particular group was to define the term people group, which anybody who's been in missions is quite familiar with that term, or at least has heard it a whole heap of times. And in their definition, they said, For evangelistic purposes, a people group is the largest group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement without encountering barriers of understanding or acceptance. Now, to my knowledge, they didn't say what church planting movement meant. I don't know what they meant by the term church planting movement in 1982, but it seems to have meant, or at least become interpreted, as a deliberate effort to plant churches. And maybe nothing more than that. Maybe that's all that it really meant. Just, we're going to try to plant churches. But the years that followed saw the rise of coordinated national efforts to plant churches, especially under the label of DAWN, which stands for Disciple a Whole Nation. And so you had these efforts on a national basis to figure out, how can we do saturation church planting, another abbreviation, SCP. In other words, how do we get enough churches in this country so that everybody can get to one easily without having to cross major barriers to do that, whether those are geographic or social barriers. And so the concept of church planting movement seemed to sort of be drawn into those efforts in the 1980s and 90s. But then in the mid to late 1990s, a group of Southern Baptist missionaries, now it's called International Mission Board, I think then it was still called Foreign Mission Board or something like that. There's a group of them that started to do some really innovative things, especially in places where they themselves couldn't stay for long because they couldn't get visas. They were non-residential missionaries. That became the term of choice. And so they were trying to figure out how to do evangelism among deeply, deeply unreached people groups when they couldn't even be there in person. And so they started coaching evangelists and church planters who did live there, who were either part of or at least neighboring cultures or neighboring peoples of those people groups. And through their combined innovation, the Southern Baptist coaches and the national partners together, they started seeing churches multiplying at a rate they had never seen before. And it was happening as generations of churches spawning churches, spawning churches, spawning churches. And so as then they were beginning to talk together to make sense of what they were seeing, there was a particular Southern Baptist researcher named David Garrison. And he was watching these things, and he provided, or at least led the group that provided the label church planting movements. Now, church planting movement as a term had already existed, but it's as if Dr. Garrison was saying, hey, you know this thing we've been talking about for 20 years? Well, we're finally seeing them. And here they are. And as it happens, they aren't coordinated organizational efforts like they thought they would be. Instead, they're spontaneous grassroots efforts. And so by virtue of what David Garrison wrote, he put all of this in a booklet, which later he expanded into a larger book, under the title Church Planting Movements. And so he became something of the father of church planting movement thought for the past 25 years. And it was at that point that it started going by the term CPM. Now, one of those Southern Baptist innovators was a guy named Steve Smith. And he learned from a couple named Ying and Grace Kai. And Steve Smith captured and systematized the Kai's approach to starting a CPM, and he labeled that Training for Trainers, or T4T for short. And since then, the T4T approach has sprouted several offshoots that are somewhat different, but they're all in the same family. And one of those offshoots, for example, is called 4 Fields. That's become pretty popular. Another one of those Southern Baptist innovators was a guy named David Watson. And David had several critical elements in his approach. And one of them was what he came to call Discovery Bible Study, or DBS. And that technique became popular so that some people started using the term DBS as shorthand for Watson's entire approach, even though that was just one piece of his entire approach. Now, Watson ended up working for a ministry called City Team International, which later spun off the organization I'm a part of, New Generations. And about 10 years after David Garrison put his stamp on church planting movements, so now we're at about 2010-ish, these New Generations founding fathers were irritated because they saw loads of people, especially Americans, calling whatever they were doing a church planting movement, even if it had no resemblance whatsoever to the sorts of things that Garrison called church planting movements. Yeah, go ahead.
Or maybe no churches even,
Right, exactly. Maybe no churches. So these guys decided to try to distinguish their efforts from others by renaming them disciple making movements. And their reasoning was that catalysts don't exactly go out to plant churches, they go out to make disciples. And as a result, churches are born. So they called the phenomenon disciple making movements, or DMMs. But to make things more confusing, though they didn't know it at the time, they also called David Watson's approach DMM, which then distinguished DMM from other approaches like T4T. So in other words, they called the phenomenon a DMM, and they called their particular approach to the catalyzing the phenomenon DMM. And after that, lots of people in the CPM world followed the shift of terms, and they too started calling the phenomenon DMMs, even though they might not practice the method called DMM. So in the meantime, totally separate from these developments, there had already been people in the West who were studying the New Testament carefully. They came to the conclusion that the most biblical and useful way to structure church isn't a comparatively large community organization, but as believers meeting in homes, which came to be called house churches. And some of them really advocated for this way of doing things, and it became known as the house church movement. Now, it happens that church planting movements often give birth to house churches, so these concepts ended up being somewhat associated, even though it's really sort of by coincidence, because they did not come from the same place. Then even more recently, there were people in Western contexts, church people, who kept trying to crack the code on how to win people to Christ. These people had lived through the innovation of megachurches, then the innovation of multi-site churches. Then they began experimenting with a new innovation called microchurches, which had house church characteristics, though the relationship with each other could be somewhat more complex, and the definition of a microchurch could be somewhat different. And then this too became
in a network. Often in a network,
exactly, right. Cynthia, often in a network. And then that too became kind of associated with the church planting movement phenomenon, even though it emerged also from a different root, and the resemblance was somewhat coincidental. And by the way, you didn't even ask about the term missional movement, which has an entirely different pedigree altogether. Sure. So that's my best overview.
Another podcast.
Another episode. Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for giving us that overview. And, it is complex, but I think what I take away from hearing you review all of that, and, you did a great job, Cory. I would very much affirm your review, and that's what I've seen as well. And is just that God has been at work. And God has been doing a lot of new things in his body, and he is creating new ways and new terms and new approaches, and new people are getting involved in doing things in new ways. And for me, though it can be confusing, all these terms, it's exciting. Like, what a wonderful day to be living when God is on the move. And really, this is just the last 25 years, what you just described. That's a lot of activity of the Holy Spirit to bring about his body's advance in just a few short years, really. In our lifetime. Agree. So exciting to hear about that. Well, we don't have a lot of time in this first part of the interview, and we will be going deeper and having a deeper dive with Cory for those who are subscribers to that. But just wanted to talk a little bit about the term DMM in particular. Which, it's one that my organization, Disciple Makers Increase, and Youth with a Mission, Frontier Missions uses. It's one that New Generations uses. A lot of people are using that term. As you said, many people shifted over to it. There's some some ways that it's very, similar to church planting movement, just different terminology. Some people use
Mhm.
those terms interchangeably, but it
Mhm.
can be a particularly confusing term because of what you mentioned. It's both a methodology and a descriptor of
Mhm.
of a product, if you want to say something that God has done.
Right.
And so, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. What do you see are the biggest issues with this term, and how can we clear them up?
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the challenges, I do think that the biggest or one of the biggest challenges is how the term can be used both for a phenomenon and an approach. But in addition to that, like any terms, it's as susceptible to overstretching as anything else. I mean, when I think about the term church planting movements, I compare it to an old pair of sweatpants that the waistband has gotten so stretched out they don't stay up on your hips anymore. They just fall down to your ankles. And in our era, I don't know if it's been like this among all people in all places at all times. I doubt it, but at least in our era, among people like us, we have a heavy tendency to stretch terms and stretch words all over the place. And there are market forces at play to do that too, that are complex. But another thing that makes it challenging for people to understand, and I find this especially for people outside what you've called and what I too call the movement world, is that the term disciple making movements, for that matter, the term church planting movements, uses the word movement different from other movements. So I think of it as the last name, first name problem. So if you think of movement as the last name, well, think of other things that have the last name movement. And if I were to ask, as an American, if I were to ask other Americans, especially people who were not Jesus followers, just ordinary person on the street, and I were to say, name as many things as you can with the last name movement, I would hear things like the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. Maybe people going historical would say the anti-slavery movement or the temperance movement. Maybe some people in a religious vein would say the charismatic movement or the Jesus movement. And in all of these, the first name tells you the thing that the movement was for. Like, it is some sort of social or political or religious, like, awareness or advocacy or social leveraging uh, exercise to try to accomplish this thing called civil rights or the environment or gay rights or whatever,
Mm,
or Jesus for that matter. When
mm,
we talk about church planting movements or disciple making movements, the first name isn't the thing that we're going for. It's the means that we're using for something to happen. So, in other words, disciple making movement is not some advocacy movement to get people to make disciples. A disciple making movement is a movement for Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God that happens to proceed by disciples making disciples. So there's a basic difference in how we even use the word movement that differs from what people ordinarily expect when they hear something with
mm.
movement as the last name.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think understanding some of the history, some of the clarity, and just being aware that not everybody uses those terms the same. So asking
Mm-hmm.
for clarity, if you're having a discussion with someone from a different organization or different stream, to be aware that they may not be talking about quite the same thing that you are, and just to ask questions. That's okay. I don't think we're going to fix that, because nobody
Agreed.
owns the term, and so just to ask questions and clarify it and make sure you're kind of on the same page about. I don't think these are things to argue about either, Cory. Do you? I mean, it's
Yeah,
just let's
I would.
clarify.
Yeah, I would say argue in one sense, but not in another. If argue means being adversarial or combative, no, that's a real waste of effort. If argue means reason, discuss, debate, put forth arguments, put forth like reasons for this or that, I think it's in that sense, I think it's absolutely something to argue about. But there's a way
Mm,
to argue without being argumentative. And I
Right.
think that's what's really essential.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good perspective. I mean, when you were talking about the sweatpants that are overstretched, the metaphor that came in my mind was the Kleenex. Kleenex was started by a company
Sure.
that owned that name, but
Yeah.
it became a common word to describe
Kleenex.
something, a Kleenex, and it's not necessarily made by Kleenex, and it's not necessarily made
Right.
the way Kleenex makes it, but
Yeah.
there is, anything you wipe your nose with that is disposable can be
Right.
defined as a Kleenex, so I think there is fluidity and we need to give space for that. But there's also some standardization that maybe is needed as we move into, especially in the academic world. How are we
Yeah.
going to use this as we write about it, as we document it? And the more agreement we can have, the less confusion people will be in when they read what we write. And even
Exactly.
being aware as you write to define your term and how you're using it in your particular article or book or training is maybe really important. Well, wow, it has
Totally
been great
agree.
to talk about this. I know the time seems really short, but we are going to go into a deeper dive interview if you're willing, Cory, willing to stay on a little bit
Oh,
longer.
can't wait. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Well, we want to do that, but tell people, Cory, how they can get in touch with you, your organization, and if people want to learn more or even dialogue with you more about this, how do they get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as far as the organization as a whole, especially the side of our organization that's aimed toward practitioners, is a website, newgenerations.network. Make sure you put an S at the end of New Generations. It's multiple generations, not one, newgenerations.network. I also want to mention that for people who are movement practitioners who want to sharpen their skills, and even for some who just want to know more, a couple of our partners are hosting events that are coming up. One of our partners, Africa Transformation Initiatives, is holding a DMM forum in March in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. That event is going to be in French. And another one of our partners, Lifeway Global, is hosting in Nairobi, Kenya, their Catalyst Camp. I think this is the 11th year now. It's become very popular. That's going to be in June, and that one is going to be conducted in English. And so I encourage you to go and look for those two partners online and register for those if you're interested in going somewhere where you can do a deeper dive.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and encourage you if you can go to any of those, do it. Yeah, we collaborate a lot, and I think collaboration is really, really key. And you may know some of this material, but you can always learn more as you hear how other people are presenting it, and you're always going to keep growing. I love to grow and learn, even if though I've been doing this for over 30 years. I go to a camp or something like that, and there's always fresh things, or maybe even the content's not different, but you're learning something new as to
Absolutely.
how it's presented. So, yeah, really encourage you guys to check those out. Well, any final words as we wrap up?
Hey, I just want to thank you for everything that you do, coaching so many people to make disciples who make disciples, to see these gatherings, spawning gatherings. And it just gives me joy to know that there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that I don't know this side of eternity who are really the great people of the earth, because they are doing
Mm.
things to make disciples that are literally the most important thing happening on the planet right now. And to me, it's just an honor to be connected with them at all. And so I'm just thrilled for this opportunity on this episode to be able to say some things that maybe might help someone.
Thank you so much. Well, we will be right back. I'll be sharing some key takeaways I got from our talk with Cory, and we'll wrap up in just a moment.
Are you ready to unlock your potential as a disciple maker? Then it is time to dive deeper into the principles that are changing lives with the Multipliers Mindset course. This transformative course accompanies the book, The Multipliers Mindset, Thinking Differently About Discipleship by Cynthia Anderson. These lessons will help you not just through reading about a multiplying movement, but how to actively live out a lifestyle that leads towards movements. And here's the best part. It comes with a practical workbook, which is designed to take your learning even further. This workbook guides you step by step to apply what you learn and to impact the lives of lost people around you. With easy-to-follow steps, uplifting lessons, and timeless truths from the book, this course equips you to make disciples and to start groups that multiply. Visit multipliersmindset.com to step further into the work God is calling you to do. Let's multiply together.
Well, that was a bit of a shorter interview, but insightful, I hope. And some of the things I really enjoyed is right at the get-go, Cory said we need to reevaluate, reassess, and re-understand some of these commonly used terms, right? And I love that. Reevaluate, reassess, and re-understand. He gave us a history of kind of how things evolved, and that was really interesting. And much of it confirmed what I already knew, but helpful, I think, to just kind of lay it out there how the Lausanne Committee on Evangelization first coined the term church planting movement without really defining it. And then the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptists, or IMB, and David Garrison further defined the term in his landmark booklet that so many thousands and thousands around the world read, the Church Planting Movement booklet. Later on, Steve Smith wrote a book about Ying Kai's methodology and what was happening through him and his wife Grace, and the term T for T came about. And this just whole history, and then how David Watson with city teams that later became New Generations had a slightly different methodology that he wanted to call disciple-making movements. And they coined that term, which was then adopted by many different missions and agencies, but not necessarily adopting that methodology fully or completely. And so all these things, some of these terms, as Cory said, get stretched so far that they're no longer having the original meaning. It's just important for us to be aware of that. And then he closed with this really helpful explanation of the first name, last name problem, and how normally in just the normal, vocabulary of people in the world, we use the word movement. And before that, in the word that comes before, like civil rights movement or other movements, we describe the cause. So we might say the civil rights movement, but with disciple-making movements and church planting movements, we're actually talking about what we're doing, not only the cause. So things get a little complicated. He talked about that. And yet we also ended on a really hopeful note that there have been so many different terms that have been used over the last 25 years. And that is an indication that God is at work doing a new thing in the world today. Don't get hung up on the terms. Don't become so loyal to your term that you defend it when other people use it wrong. That would be my encouragement to you. But know the terms and know a little bit about them so that you can collaborate and have dialogue with other people in the disciple multiplication, church multiplication space. And I just went to a gathering of pastors here in the United States, and the room was titled Church Multiplication. But what they were doing was radically different from my understanding of church multiplication. So I just had a context, so I had to put this into practice. We want to be people who partner and collaborate as much as we can for the causes of the kingdom, right? But it's important to define your terms and know that what other people mean by something may not be what you do. So just ask questions, curious questions. And so next time you hear one of these terms, my action step for you is ask a few questions. Tell me a little more what you mean when you say DMM. Tell me a little more what you mean. And learn from them and hear what they're defining it as personally. Not that that's wrong, but that's their definition. And then you know how to have further dialogue and further conversation with them. So again, you don't want to miss that deeper dive interview. It was amazing. Lots of insights that you're going to want to get. So be sure to subscribe to that. To the membership that we offer. That's going to give you some additional really good content, but it's also something we just really appreciate those who have become members. and it supports and provides for this podcast to exist. So if you've benefited from this, please consider signing up to become a member of Dare to Multiply and support us in that way, plus get some additional awesome content. And the last announcement I want to make is that we are starting a new series, Jen and I, and it won't start next week, but the week after that. And we are going to be talking about couples making disciples together. And you're going to get a real treat because our husbands will be coming on the show. Jen with her husband starting us off, Stephen, and they'll be talking about the why of working together. We'll be talking about different models. Todd and I have a little different model we use, and Jen and Stephen. Todd and I will be on there talking about some of the problems and complications of working together in disciple making, but also some of the amazing benefits. And I think you're going to really enjoy this. Even if you're single, this is going to help you as you train your team and you have couples in ministry together, couples that are working with you on your team. So I really am looking forward to doing this together with Jen and Todd and Stephen. So you can look forward to that. God bless you guys. Keep making and multiplying disciples. That's all we've got for this episode of Dare to Multiply. One thing that would really help both us and other people who might like to listen in is for you to rate and review the podcast, if you haven't done that yet, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'd also love to connect with you on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Feel free to message me with any topics, questions you'd like addressed, or guests you'd like me to interview. Until next week then, please remember, no matter how ordinary you feel, God's dreams for us are always bigger than we can imagine. Let's dare to trust Him for a greater harvest.